Good morning. It is my great pleasure to introduce the counsel to the president, Neil Eggleston. I don't know how I can top Walter's introduction, but let me just say that there is nobody who has a better understanding of and more experience with the issues that come up in all three branches than Neil Eggleston. He has served in high-ranking positions in all three branches, including as a law clerk to Chief Justice Warren Burger. And I have had the opportunity to work closely with Neil on 3 occasions and to see him grapple with these issues up close. And the first was almost 30 years ago, 30 years, Neil. On Iran-Contra, I was working in the Office of Independent Counsel, the office of Judge Lawrence Walsh, and Neil was one of the top lawyers for the House Select Committee on Iran-Contra. And among the challenges that Neil had at the time was the ranking minority member on that committee, a congressman named Dick Cheney. And then a little more than 20 years ago, Neil and I worked closely together as colleagues in the White House counsel's office under President Clinton. And those were interesting times, as Walter will recall, and I will just leave it at that. And most recently, I worked closely with Neil when I was special envoy for Guantanamo closure in 2013 and 2014. And I will tell you that a fair amount of Neil's time is spent on Guantanamo and other issues that can fairly be characterized, in my view, as having been created in great part by a person named Dick Cheney. And so Neil's career has come full circle now. But I do want to say that there is nobody in Washington who is more well-respected and better liked from everybody across the political spectrum than Neil Eggleston. Neil, it's an honor to have you with us this morning. Thank you.
So, Cliff, thanks so much for that introduction. It was terrific, except reminding me how long ago it was that we first met, 30 years ago. And I did, if you hadn't said it, I was going to just thank you for the fantastic work you did in connection with the Guantanamo work that you did at the State Department. It's as important a work as being done, and you did it fantastically. You moved things really effectively when you were there and really set up the next person who's continuing to work in your footsteps, and so we really want to thank you for that. Obviously, when I heard that there was a panel before me on the Imperial Presidency, I thought to myself, well, I should go to that because I'm a history buff, and that'll be about the Bush administration. And that will be really fun. But anyway, that was an interesting panel. I really enjoyed that. My daughter is here today. She's home, lives in Providence, Rhode Island, as a teacher, and I kept leaning over to her and saying, they're criticizing another thing I did. So I appreciate that. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about a different issue, but I just want to say I enjoyed that panel. I can't tell you how much time I spend thinking about the issues that were discussed in the last hour and a half. And there were a variety of views. I consider those views. I read deeply in these areas. It's enormously important to me. And in fact, just hearing the presentation today helps me in thinking about the issues that were discussed and the advice that I give to the president in this issue. So you heard quite a presentation this morning from real experts in this area, and I really thank you for the work that you did. I want to talk about a different issue, though, this morning. I would like to talk about the work the administration has been doing in the area of criminal justice. The reason I wanted to do this is that there's been some publicity at various different times about individual isolated actions in which we're involved. What I think people do not really understand is the breadth of activity that this administration has been involved in. We are in what the president calls the fourth quarter of his administration. We're pretty close to the fourth quarter of the fourth quarter, actually. And actually, this just gives me a moment. I want to get back to what Walter said, which I made a note to do. Walter, I've been in this job for a little over 2 years, and it sounds like that constraint of the job at this point would probably feel pretty good. Maybe I would work less than 7 days a week, and so there are times when I think abolishing it would be a great idea, but only from the time constraint. And actually, I should be serious. Obviously, I think about the role of the White House counsel with regard to OLC and the Attorney General, and I think that we have the balance about right and reject the notion that there should be a difference in connection with that. But getting back to criminal justice, I just want to say that significant attention at the very highest levels in this administration has gone into reforming our criminal justice system. It's a testament to the personal investment by the President of the United States in this issue. I think it reflects his view and his recognition that the ways that our criminal justice system hinders the opportunities for millions of Americans. He sees the urgency of this issue and is very committed to doing something about it, and he's doing something about it every day. Even though incarcerated individuals and the formerly incarcerated are people who essentially have no political or economic clout by any measure, their stories and their struggles have influenced the President of the United States. I'm eager to use my time to say more about why I am so encouraged about this work. I'll talk about why the President believes there is urgent need. I will talk a little bit about our clemency work and the importance of criminal justice legislation. These two issues get the most amount of attention, but I want to talk about some others as well, because they directly affect the problem of unduly harsh sentences at the federal level. But I want to talk about some other initiatives, including initiatives to help the formerly incarcerated successfully re-enter society. These include removing barriers that make it difficult for the formerly incarcerated to obtain employment and education and housing. We're also addressing excessive bails and fines and fees that can have essentially the effect of criminalizing poverty. And finally, I want to talk about common sense gun control and measures that can keep firearms out of the hands of the wrong people. This work is critical. All of these efforts are critical to the effort to reform the criminal justice system. Almost a year ago, in a speech in Philadelphia in front of the NAACP, the President laid out a comprehensive case for the urgency of reforming the criminal justice system. The case begins with sobering statistics. Many of you know them, but I'm going to give them because there's a reminder of just how large the problem really is. I started as a prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office in the early 1980s in New York, Southern District of New York. At the time, there were 500,000 people behind bars in the United States. Today, there are 2.2 million. The United States has 5% of the world's population, but 25% of its inmates. We keep more people behind bars than the top 35 European countries combined. So let me talk about the costs. They are also staggering. The federal government spends more than $6 billion a year to house prisoners. It is by far the greatest proportion of the Department of Justice budget. If you add the amount spent at the state and local level, the amount rises to an estimated $80 billion per year that is spent on keeping people in jail. Those are staggering numbers, but those don't begin to impact and show the impact on people's lives. There are an estimated 70 million or more Americans with criminal records and the attendant restrictions and challenges that come from having a criminal record. Each year, more than 11 million Americans cycle in and out of our jail system. And in too many communities, especially communities of color and those struggling with poverty and addiction, the justice system has touched almost every block and every family. The numbers that I've just given overall are affecting to me. But for me, and I have seen for the President as well, the individual stories are even more affecting. Many of these stories reach my desk as clemency petitions. My office is heavily involved. We're essentially the point of the spear in the efforts that the President is doing to get worthy people released from prison. The most well-known is what's called the President's Clemency Initiative. I think it speaks volumes about the priorities of this President, that he has used this power to historic ends. To date, he has commuted the sentences of 348 individuals. This is more than the last 7 presidents combined. The great majority of these people have already served more time than the sentence that they would receive today. And the statistic in here I like best is that 130 of these were serving life sentences for drug offenses. Through his words and his actions, the president has made it clear that he is committed to using his clemency power in ways not seen from any other president in the modern era. Our work is ongoing. You can anticipate seeing many more grants of clemency. As I say, we have 7 months left, and we're going to run through the tape on this and every issue. In March, I met at the White House with 5 commutation recipients in the Roosevelt Room, and later the president, in a surprise move, quite a surprise, not a surprise to me, a surprise to them, we went up to Busboys and Poets at 14th and U and all had lunch together. It was a fantastic event. You can imagine how big a surprise it was for them, many of whom had been released and had been serving life sentences only months before they were having a lunch with the President of the United States. While those men and women had very different life experiences, they told remarkably similar stories about receiving clemency. One of the attendees is a man by the name of Norman Brown. He remembered when he was first summoned to his case manager's office. As you might guess, he thought, the reaction was, well, what have I done? What have I done wrong? Because the only time you get called in is to get yelled at or disciplined or whatever. He was told that he was going to, be released in November, and his response was, November of what year? Because he had no sense that he had been granted clemency. I think he was in for life, and it was such a shock to him. I also met Ramona Brandt, whose story is also typical of many. She was convicted of involvement of a conspiracy to distribute cocaine. Her boyfriend was the leader of the conspiracy, and she later described the physical and emotional control that he maintained over her. At the time, the sentencing guidelines were mandatory. After a Supreme Court case called Booker, they were no longer mandatory, but at the time, the sentencing guidelines were mandatory, and her guideline was life imprisonment. She was a first offender. The judge at the time said it would be counterproductive to society to keep Ramona in prison for the rest of her life, but he had no choice to give her that sentence, and until her sentence was commuted, she thought she would die in prison. Her case is emblematic of the problems with overly harsh mandatory sentences. The federal inmate population remains heavily weighted towards nonviolent drug offenders, in large part because of these harsh federal mandatory minimum sentences. The individuals I met with represent not just the flaws of the mandatory minimum sentences, but also demonstrated what we can achieve when given a second chance. In addition to Norman and Ramona, I had the pleasure to meet Serena Nunn. Some of you know her story. At age 19, she was sentenced to 15 years in prison for her role helping her drug-dealing boyfriend. Unfortunately, I have to say, as someone who sees a lot of clemency petitions, that one sentence is one that I see all too often. She served 11 years. In 2000, she was granted a commutation of sentence by President Clinton. But what is so inspiring about her is what came next. 4 days after her sentence was commuted, she enrolled at Arizona State University. From there, she graduated. She went to Michigan Law School, a darn tough law school to get into. Graduated in 2006. Passed the bar, and is now a public defender working to advance the interests of her client, much as she had a public defender when she went through the criminal justice system. Clemency is obviously an important power that the Constitution gives to the president. It's an express power in the Constitution. But to bring about real, meaningful reform on a much broader basis, we really need the passage of criminal justice reform legislation. Since the beginning of the administration, we have made progress. In 2010, the president signed the Fair Sentencing Act, a really important and far-reaching statute that reduce the disparity in mandatory minimums between crack and powder cocaine sentences. One of the reasons this is so important because of the disparate racial impact those prosecutions and those drugs had on the African American community particularly. The Department of Justice around the same time announced something called its Smart on Crime initiative, reversing a decision by then Attorney General Ashcroft. And essentially what it did was amended its charging policies so that prosecutors did not have to charge the toughest available count and that would then have the longest available sentence. This change, which was a policy change by the Department of Justice, has helped in avoiding overly long sentences and permitted the U.S. Attorney's offices to direct their attention to the most serious crimes and the most serious offenders. Now we're working with parties, both parties in Congress, to try to build on new legislation. I'll just talk about this briefly. It's important, but a lot of you know about it. The Senate is doing well. They have a good bill that has both Republican and Democratic support at the very high range. Senator Lee is on the bill. Senator Cornyn, very supportive. Senator Grassley. On the Democratic side, Senators Durbin, Booker, and Lee are also prime movers in the bill. We hope that it will get some floor time from Leader McConnell, and we can get that through the Senate as soon as possible. In addition, there is some activity on the House side. Chairman Goodlatte and Ranking Member Conyers also have legislation that they're trying to get through, and we hope to see a bill that the President can sign before the year is out. But I now want to get to some places and some issues that you may have heard less about that are no less important. The President has made it clear that more transformative change is needed than just reducing the extent of incarceration. There are so many other ways in which the challenges of our criminal justice system intersect with other issues that weaken communities. Too often, the current system takes away the opportunities the young have to lead a bright future. Last summer, President Obama became the first sitting president in history to visit a federal prison while in office. He traveled to El Reno, Oklahoma, and visited the federal prison there. And he met with 6 inmates. I did not go on that trip with him, but he met with 6 inmates there. And those of you who followed the reporting may remember his comments afterwards. He said, visiting with these 6 individuals, these are young people who made mistakes that aren't that different from the mistakes that I made. The difference is they did not have the kinds of support structures, the second chances, the resources that would allow them to survive those mistakes. I know that when the President presses his team, which includes me, to reform the system and to work on these issues, he is thinking about those experiences. He's thinking of the need for all young people to have support structure, the importance of giving everyone the tools they need to earn their second chance. The President has spoken regularly about the tragedy of too many in this country who do not realize their full potential, because they have never really had a chance. And because we know the problem with so many causes and dimensions, the President is focusing on ensuring that we have a comprehensive approach to tackling it. Just as we in the White House are focusing on clemency and working with Congress on legislation, the departments and agencies have taken up the call as well. The Attorney General has successfully, who's just done a terrific job in this area, has successfully led a cabinet-level working group on re-entry. There are people at the Department of Justice, they're criticized every once in a while for just wanting to throw people in jail. Well, I can tell you they are entirely committed to the Clemency Initiative, and those who say that they're not are not right, and they're entirely committed to the Reentry Initiative. The group brings together all relevant departments and agencies to support the government's work on rehabilitation and reintegration of individuals returning to their communities from prisons and jails. At the end of April, just this year, 2 months ago, the President signed a memorandum formally establishing the group as the Federal Interagency Reentry Council to ensure that its important work will continue. Thanks in part to that council's efforts, we have seen an exceptionally broad push to use the tools available to the executive branch to ease the barriers to reentry at various levels. including the number of important initiatives and actions that were announced really since the beginning of 2016. This work begins by ensuring that we are not just housing people in our jail simply because they are too poor to pay a fine or to make bail. The White House's Council on Economic Advisors recently put out a report that highlighted how often even relatively low bail requirements can result in unnecessary incarceration. In New York City in 2010, only 21% of arrestees made bail and arraignment for bail amounts of less than $500. And the rest of that study goes on to show that people who are incarcerated pretrial, even on relatively minor charges, eventually plead guilty because their lawyers tell them that if you plead guilty, whether you did it or not, if you plead guilty, you can get out of jail, and thereby starts their cycle in the criminal justice system, because once you get in, as many people in this room know, it's darn hard to get out. New York City, actually under Cy Vance, has done some terrific recent work in this area, and I commend him for the work that he has done up there to reform the bail practices in New York, and I'm sure there's a lot more work to be done there in other places. There is similar urgency with respect to the use of fines and fees. This is an issue that drew heightened attention because of the examination of the practices primarily in Ferguson. People remember that the findings in Ferguson was essentially that the city was financing the city government through the use of fines and fees as opposed to imposing them as appropriate in connection with the individual and the crime that had been committed. I'm very pleased and told her directly when she had done it that the Department of Justice's head of the Civil Rights Division, Vanita Gupta, recently sent a letter to the state chief justices and state court administrators regarding their legal obligations with respect to the enforcement of fines and fees. The letter addressed some of the most common practices that run afoul of the Constitution and other federal laws. Last year, the Departments of Education and Justice announced the Second Chance Pell Pilot Program to allow incarcerated Americans to receive Pell Grants to pursue post-secondary education and trainings. So these people who are getting Pell Grants to go to college while they are in prison, so they are in a better position when they get out of prison to get a job and get on with their life and have the second chance to which they're entitled. That assistance can help them turn their lives around. I want to talk just briefly. I was briefed on this yesterday, and I'm going to hope I don't muddle it, but there's some really exciting work being done at the Department of Justice, at the White House, on something called data-driven justice. And essentially, this is an initiative to use data in a way to better target who needs help and who needs to be in the system and who does not. I will give an example. Miami-Dade worked with partners to identify the highest utilizers of acute care, jails, and hospitals and other services. They found that 97 heavy users, most individuals who were homeless and most were diagnosed with schizophrenia. Over a 5-year period, these individuals accounted for over 38,000 days in either jail, hospitals, ER, or inpatient psychiatric services. Imagine the cost of these people if you think about it. Cycling, they're arrested, they're sent to jail, they're sent to a hospital, massive utilization of resources. The cost to the taxpayer, $13.7 million, and since it was just a cycle, it had no impact on reducing the recidivism. In response, Miami-Dade came together working with the White House, I think. White House is having a convening on Monday with a number of jurisdictions which are looking into how you could deal with these people and get them out of the criminal justice system and into a healthcare facility, which would be dramatically cheaper. And it's the kind of work and forward thinking that are going to help these people. If you think about it, they're put in jail, they're found homeless, they're put in jail, they're put back out on the street, but nothing has changed. So what's going to happen? A few days later, they will just be arrested and put back in jail again. Or instead, they go to an emergency room. And as everyone knows, the hospitals obviously have to take people who have need emergency room treatment. But there's a real effort to focus on these people both to reduce costs, which is one of the reasons these jurisdictions are interested in doing it, but in addition to reducing costs, also just to have some ability to help these people who are otherwise going to be in a cycle out of which they can really never get. In January of this year, moving on, the President announced he was directing the Department of Justice to implement important reforms to the way the solitary confinement system is used in the federal system. That includes banning solitary confinement for juveniles, as well as in response to low-level infractions, expanding the treatment for the mentally ill, increasing the amount of time inmates spend out of their cells, and ensuring that inmates are not released directly from solitary confinement into the community. These steps will affect some 10,000 federal prisoners. And in addition, and we thought about this at the time, that becomes a model for state and local facilities as well to think through how they are using solitary confinement and the impact that that has on the people who are confined. Other reforms are about easing the needlessly harsh collateral consequences that make it difficult for the formerly incarcerated to get a fair chance. This spring, the Federal Office of Personnel Management announced a proposed rule to ban the box, which would prohibit federal agencies from asking questions about criminal and credit history for applicants for tens of thousands of jobs in the competitive service, as well as in the career executive senior service, until a conditional offer of employment had been made, essentially telling the federal agencies, you can't ask it at the beginning. You got to evaluate these people on the basis of what you see. You get to ask it further down the line so you can consider it, but don't use it as a method to keep people who may have valid experience and have turned their lives around from getting the consideration to which they're entitled for a job, and it's really having an impact. That's what we're doing in the federal system, but obviously this is a big issue in private the sector as well. The White House launched what it called its Fair Chance Business Pledge. It was announced in April with a roundtable of major U.S. companies, including American Airlines, Coca-Cola Company, Facebook, and Prudential. Within 2 weeks, that list grew to more than 100 companies that together employ 1.5 million people, and we're continuing to see that list grow, and I commend those companies for their sensitivity to this issue. The same month, the Department of Housing and Urban Development released guidance on the use of criminal records by providers of housing and public housing authorities. The guidance explained that a criminal history screening process may violate the Fair Housing Act if it disproportionately excludes individuals of a particular race or other protected characteristics. Department of Education recently emphasized the importance of going beyond the box in college applications because unnecessarily broad questions about criminal history can often deter and discourage qualified students from pursuing a college degree. It should be clear that even as we do these things, we continue to press forward on public safety initiatives that ensure that we can support communities struggling with violence. A year and a half ago, the President announced the 21st Century Policing Task Force. I was pleased to have been able to help put that together and have worked with them repeatedly. Just really, what he wanted were common sense, practical, and implementable recommendations to improve community police relations and the ability of police in a tough time. We put so much on our police officers, as I mentioned earlier, spent so much time making them mental health professionals and really more than they should ever be asked to do. Very excellent recommendations by that policing task force. I was really pleased with the work they did, and more importantly, the President was pleased with the work they did. But one of the things, obviously, this President has been talking about is common sense ways to address gun violence. We want to strengthen the background check system to reduce the opportunities for guns to fall into the wrong hands. We're also committed to advance smart gun technology because all too often guns are discharged accidentally, and as we all read in the paper, tragically, frequently by children, or guns that are stolen from their rightful owners to be used for criminal purposes. And it also helps that ensuring we have funding to invest in state and local police and other critical public safety initiatives. This is an imperative the President raises with me regularly, and he also raises with the Attorney General. It resonates with my own formative experience with the criminal justice system. When I worked as an assistant United States attorney in Manhattan in the 1980s, I saw firsthand how crime can destroy communities. But we believe strongly that the way to be tough on crime is to invest in strategies that work and not simply in longer sentences. Giving someone released from prison a real opportunity to obtain housing, a degree, a job is a better investment and better for our country than paying to incarcerate that person over and over again. It ensures that our criminal justice system does not simply perpetuate and reinforce the disparities that too often persist in our country. I feel fortunate in many ways, despite what Walter said, to have served this president at this moment in history. We are working on these issues. It's been among the most rewarding work that I have done as White House counsel, and we are all committed to seeing this through the rest of the administration. Thank you for your time.